The massive doors of the Galactic Senate opened with a deep rumbling sound that shook the floor. Jake Morrison walked through them, his boots clicking on the smooth black stone. He had never seen anything like this place before. The chamber stretched up so high that he could barely see the ceiling. Thousands of seats filled the curved walls, each one designed for a different alien species. Jake wore his best military uniform, but he still felt small in this enormous room. 6 months ago, humans had made first contact with the galaxy. 6 months ago, they learned they were not alone. Now Jake stood as Earth's first representative to this ancient government that ruled over 12 different species across hundreds of worlds. The other delegates sat in perfect silence. Jake could see creatures that looked like walking crystals, others that seemed to be made of light itself, and beings covered in thick shells with multiple arms. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They all sat and waited. At the center of the chamber stood a tall podium made of black stone that gleamed like a mirror. Behind it sat the Chancellor, a being called Vextai who belonged to the Zelhari species. His crystal body pulsed with a soft blue light as he looked down at Jake with what might have been disappointment. The Galactic Senate recognizes the human observer, Chancellor Vextai said. His voice echoed through the chamber without any warmth. You may present your species' formal greeting to the assembly. Jake looked down at the piece of paper in his hand. Earth's best diplomats had spent weeks writing the perfect speech. Every word had been chosen carefully. Every sentence had been checked and double-checked to make sure it would not offend any of the alien species. He read the first line silently. Greetings, honored members of the Galactic Senate. Humanity humbly requests your wisdom and guidance as we take our first steps into the greater community of civilized worlds. Jake crumpled up the paper and threw it on the floor. The silence in the chamber suddenly felt different. He could hear the shocked breathing of a dozen different species. Some delegates leaned forward in their seats. Others seemed to pull back, as if Jake had just pulled out a weapon. Thank you, Chancellor, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. My name is Jake Morrison, and I represent the United Earth Coalition. We didn't come here to read pretty words off a piece of paper. We came here because there's a problem, and apparently nobody in this room is allowed to talk about it. Chancellor's crystal body began to glow red. Observer Morrison, you will follow proper procedures or be removed from these chambers immediately. Procedures? Jake stepped away from the podium and looked around the chamber. Your procedures are the problem. Ships are disappearing in the outer systems. Entire colonies have gone dark. People are dying, and instead of talking about how to help them, everyone sits here following rules written by dead aliens. Jake had done his homework before coming here. Earth's intelligence services had been busy during their 6 months in space. They had learned about the silence protocol that governed this place. 3,000 years ago, a war had nearly destroyed galactic civilization. Not a war fought with weapons, but a war fought with words. Species had argued and insulted each other until the arguments became fights, and the fights became massacres. The survivors had created the silence protocol to make sure it never happened again. Every species learned to speak only when given permission. They learned to use careful, polite words that would never offend anyone. They learned to never disagree in public, never raise their voices, never speak the truth, if the truth might hurt someone's feelings. The silence protocol exists for good reason, Chancellor Vextai said, all 4 of his arms raised in a gesture that meant extreme displeasure. The great war of words nearly destroyed us all. We will not allow your species to bring that chaos back to these chambers. Security, the Chancellor called out. Remove this human immediately. But something unexpected happened. In one of the high seats, a delegate stood up. Jake recognized him from the briefing files. Hive Speaker Zektar of the Korthak Collective. His insect-like body was covered in shiny black armor, and his large compound eyes reflected the light from the chamber's glowing walls. Wait, Hive Speaker Zektar said. His voice was made up of clicking sounds that the translation system turned into words. Perhaps we should hear what the human has to say. Another delegate rose to her feet. Ambassador Lysandra of the Meridian Empire, looked like she was made of starlight wrapped in the shape of a woman. Her species rarely showed any emotion, but now her light pulsed with something that might have been curiosity. "The human speaks of problems in the outer systems," she said. "My people have also detected unusual readings from those regions, but our reports are still being processed through the proper channels." More delegates began to stand. The Altarian representative, a tall being with blue skin and 4 arms. The Corvash delegate, who looked like a walking tree made of metal. One by one, 8 of the 12 species in the Senate got to their feet. "Let him speak," said Hive Speaker Zektar. "It has been a long time since anyone spoke truth in this chamber without asking permission first." Jake nodded his thanks to the alien delegates who had chosen to support him. He could see that Chancellor Vextai was furious, but the Chancellor could not ignore the will of 8 different species. "Thank you," Jake said. "Now, about those missing ships. Earth has been investigating the disappearances for the past 3 months. We didn't ask anyone's permission because people were dying, while we waited for the paperwork to go through." He pressed a button on the small device in his pocket. The chamber's main display screen came to life, showing a star map of the Outer Rim territories. Red dots marked the locations where ships and colonies had vanished. 17 colonies have gone silent in the past 6 months, Jake continued. "The pattern isn't random. Something is moving through space, hitting settlements in a specific order. Something big, something organized, and something that doesn't care about your diplomatic procedures." The display changed to show intercepted communications from the missing colonies. The messages were incomplete and filled with static, but certain words came through clearly, words that made several of the older delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. "The last message we received was from Mining Station, Omega 7, Jake said. "They reported strange growths appearing throughout their facility, crystalline structures that seemed to convert everything they touched into something else." The station commander's final words were, "They're not dead, they're back. The Devourers are back." The word Devourers hit the chamber like a bomb going off in reverse. Instead of an explosion, there was a sudden, complete silence that seemed to suck all the sound out of the air. Ambassador Lysandra's light flickered like a candle in the wind. "That is impossible. The Devourers were destroyed in the First War 10,000 years ago. Every trace of their species was eliminated." "Apparently not," Jake said grimly. "And while you've all been sitting here being polite to each other, they've been preparing for round 2. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Dr. Lisa Grant stood in the small room next to the main Senate chamber, her fingers moving quickly over the floating holographic displays. She was Earth's top expert on alien technology, and right now she was preparing to show the galactic government something that would change everything. "Jake." Morrison's voice came through the communication system as he continued talking to the assembled delegates. Lisa could hear the tension in his voice, but also the determination. He was doing exactly what they had planned. He was forcing the aliens to face the truth they had been avoiding. "Show them the Kepler 442 footage," Jake said through their private communication channel. Lisa activated the main display system that connected to the Senate chamber. The massive screen that dominated the center of the room came to life with images that made several delegates gasp in horror. The footage came from automated probes that Earth had sent to investigate the missing colonies. What they found was not what anyone had expected. The colonies were not destroyed. They were changed. Where human settlements had once stood, twisted metal structures now reached toward the sky like the arms of dying giants. The buildings had been transformed into something else. Something alien and wrong. Crystalline growths covered everything, pulsing with a sickly green light that hurt to look at. "This is Colony 7 on Kepler 442b. Lisa's voice came through the communication system as she provided commentary for the images. "Population 12,000. They sent their last message 6 weeks ago, reporting unusual mineral deposits appearing overnight." The camera view shifted to show the colony's main street. The buildings were still recognizable, but they had been twisted and stretched like clay in the hands of a mad sculptor. Worse yet, the streets themselves seemed to be moving, rippling, like water even though they were made of solid concrete. The probe detected massive bioelectrical activity throughout the settlement, Lisa continued. Whatever did this, it's converting matter at the molecular level, turning our colonies into something else entirely. In the Senate chamber, Ambassador Lysandra's light form flickered with what her species called deep fear. The conversion process, she whispered. It is exactly as the old records describe. The Devourers do not simply destroy their enemies. They remake them. Chancellor Vextai's crystal body had turned from red to a dark purple color that indicated extreme distress. This information should have been processed through the proper intelligence committees. It should have been analyzed and verified through official channels before being presented to this body. Through what channels? Dr. Grant's voice carried clearly through the chamber's speakers. She had patched herself directly into the Senate's communication system, something that violated about 15 different protocols. The same channels that took you 3 years to approve a simple trade agreement, the same system that requires 47 different signatures before sharing basic scientific data. The display changed again, this time showing a timeline of bureaucratic delays. Lisa had spent weeks researching the Senate's procedures, and what she found was a government so afraid of making mistakes that it could barely function at all. Mining Station Omega-7 sent 14 separate distress calls, she said. They followed every proper procedure. They filled out the correct forms, used the appropriate communication protocols, and waited for authorization to request emergency assistance. They died waiting for someone to decide whether their situation qualified as a true emergency. Jake's voice cut through the growing murmur of voices in the chamber. Dr. Grant, show them the pattern analysis. The display shifted to show a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy's outer rim. Red markers indicated the locations of missing or converted colonies, while yellow markers showed settlements that had reported unusual activity but had not yet been attacked. The Devourers aren't moving randomly, Lisa explained. They're following the major shipping routes, hitting colonies in order of strategic importance. They're not just converting random settlements. They're building a network. Hive Speaker Zektar's compound eyes focused on the display with the intensity of a predator studying prey. A network for what purpose? Supply lines, Jake answered. Each converted colony becomes a staging ground for the next attack. They're not just destroying our outer defenses. They're turning them into weapons pointed at the core worlds. The implications of this hit the chamber like a physical blow. Several delegates began talking at once, their voices creating a cacophony of different languages and communication methods. For the first time in 3,000 years, the silence protocol was breaking down completely. How long? Ambassador, Lysandra asked, her voice cutting through the noise. How long before they reach the core systems? Dr. Grant manipulated the display, showing projected attack paths based on the observed pattern. At their current rate of expansion, they'll reach the first core world colonies within 8 months. The major population centers within 2 years. 2 years to prepare, muttered the Altarian delegate, a tall being with blue skin named Commander Felthar. 2 years to coordinate the defenses of 12 different species with 12 different military systems. 2 years to get approval for a coordinated defense, Jake corrected grimly. How long did it take this Senate to approve the construction of the new communication relay network? Chancellor Vexitai's purple coloration deepened. 7 years. But that was a complex infrastructure project with significant resource implications. This is a war, Jake said flatly. Wars don't wait for committee approval. The Korvash delegate, whose metal tree appearance made him look like a walking sculpture, spoke for the first time since Jake had arrived. The human speaks truth. In my younger cycles, I fought in the border conflicts. Wars are won by those who act quickly, not by those who deliberate wisely. But without proper coordination, without following established procedures, Chancellor, Vexti protested, we risk another war of words. We risk the very chaos that the silence protocol was created to prevent. Dr. Grant's voice came through the speakers again, but this time there was something different in her tone. Something harder. Chancellor, with respect, your silence protocol is about to get everyone in the galaxy killed. The chamber fell completely silent. Even the background hum of the life support systems seemed to pause. For 3 months, Earth has been trying to share this information with the galactic community, Lisa continued. We submitted our initial findings through proper channels 97 days ago. Those reports are still sitting in committee, waiting for approval to be classified and distributed to the relevant security agencies. She manipulated the display again, showing a flowchart of the Senate's information processing procedures. The chart was so complex that it looked like a spider web designed by an insane mathematician. While our report sat in committee, 6 more colonies died, while your security agencies debated the proper classification level for our intelligence data. The Devourers expanded their network by 30%. While you worried about following the correct procedures, actual people with actual families were converted into raw materials for an alien war machine. Jake stepped closer to the center of the chamber, looking up at the assembled delegates. You want to know how Earth gathered all this intelligence in just 6 months? How we managed to map Devourer movements when your combined intelligence services missed them entirely? He paused, letting the question hang in the air. We didn't ask permission. When we detected the first disappearances, we sent ships to investigate. When those ships found evidence of hostile activity, we sent more ships. When we realized the scope of the threat, we started sharing information immediately with anyone who would listen. We acted like people's lives depended on making the right decision quickly, because they did. The silence stretched on for several long moments. Finally, Hive Speaker Zektar spoke. What do you propose, human? Jake looked around the chamber at the faces of a dozen different species. Some looked frightened, others looked angry, a few looked hopeful. We propose that you start talking to each other like the galaxy depends on it, he said. Because it does. The emergency session had been going on for 14 hours. Jake Morrison sat in a chair that was too small for humans, designed for the Altarian delegates who were shorter and had different body proportions. His back ached. His throat was dry from talking, and his patience with galactic bureaucracy had run out about 6 hours ago. Around the chamber, delegates from 12 different species argued with each other in ways that hadn't been seen for 3,000 years. The silence protocol was completely broken now. Voices rose and fell in a dozen different languages. Translation systems worked overtime to keep up with the heated discussions. Commander Ben Taylor stood in the war room that connected to the Senate chambers, watching tactical displays that showed the growing Devourer threat. As Earth's top military strategist, he had been brought to the capital to help coordinate the defense of the galaxy. What he found was a military command structure so tangled up in procedures that it could barely function. Sir, called Lieutenant Amy Foster, Jake's aide and one of the youngest officers in Earth's diplomatic corps. The Altarian Defense Fleet is requesting permission to engage Devourer scouts in the Vega system. Ben looked at the tactical display. 3 Devourer ships were approaching an Altarian mining operation. The mining station had 12,000 workers and their families. The Altarian fleet could intercept the enemy ships and destroy them easily, but they needed authorization from the Military Oversight Committee. How long for authorization? Ben asked. Amy checked her datapad. The Military Oversight Committee needs approval from the Planetary Security Council. The Security Council needs ratification from the Senate Defense Subcommittee. The Defense Subcommittee needs to verify the request through the Intelligence Classification Board. How long? Ben repeated. 4 to 6 days, assuming no one requests additional documentation. Ben stared at the tactical display. In 4 to 6 days, 12,000 people would be dead or worse. He made a decision that violated so many regulations that he stopped counting after 20. Open a direct channel to Admiral Chen of the Altarian Defense Fleet. Amy's eyes went wide. Sir, that bypasses the entire chain of command. That's a direct violation of at least 6 different treaties. Good. Do it anyway. The communication system crackled to life, and Admiral Chen's face appeared on the screen. She was a veteran officer with gray hair and scars on her face from the border conflicts. Her expression showed the frustration that every military commander in the galaxy was feeling. Admiral Chen, this is Commander Taylor of Earth Defense Command. We're transmitting all tactical data on Devourer positions and capabilities. You have full human support for immediate engagement. The relief on Admiral Chen's face was obvious. Thank you, Commander. My people have been ready to move for hours, but we were waiting for proper authorization, moving to intercept now. In the main chamber, news of humanity's unilateral action sent shockwaves through the assembled delegates. Chancellor Vextai's crystal form turned bright red with anger. The humans have violated 17 separate accords, he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. They have bypassed established chains of command, ignored diplomatic procedures, and acted without consensus from this body. This is exactly the kind of reckless behavior that the Silence Protocol was designed to prevent. Ambassador Lysandra's light form pulsed with an emotion her species rarely displayed in public: anger. Her people were known for their calm rationality, but now her light flickered like a flame in a strong wind. The reckless behavior that saved my homeworld 3 hours ago when human forces destroyed a Devourer probe ship approaching our orbital stations? The protocol exists for good reason, Chancellor Vextai insisted. The Great War of Words was caused by exactly this kind of impulsive action, species acting without consultation, making unilateral decisions that affected others. The Great War of Words was 3,000 years ago. Hive speaker Zektar's chittering voice rose to a volume that his species used only in extreme circumstances. And it was caused by pride and stubbornness, not by people trying to save lives. Dr. Lisa Grant had been listening to the arguments from the war room, but now she walked into the main chamber without asking for permission. Protocol demanded that only official delegates could speak on the Senate floor, but she was past caring about protocol. You want to know why we don't follow your procedures? She said, her voice cutting through the noise of a dozen different arguments. Because people die while you debate the proper way to save them. The chamber fell silent. Dr. Grant was not a diplomat or a military officer. She was a scientist, a researcher who had spent her life studying how things worked. Now she stood in the center of the galaxy's most important political body and spoke truth that no one wanted to hear. 3 days ago, the colony on Kepler 438b sent out a distress call, she continued. They reported crystalline growths appearing in their agricultural domes. They followed every proper procedure. They filed the correct reports, used the appropriate communication channels, and waited for instructions. She activated the chamber's display system, showing footage from the colony's final hours. They waited for 18 hours while their reports worked through the proper channels. 18 hours while the crystalline growth spread through their food supply. 18 hours while their children started showing signs of molecular conversion. The images on the screen showed people changing, their bodies becoming part of the alien structures that were consuming their world. It was horrifying, but it was also the truth. The colony administrator sent 43 separate requests for emergency assistance. Every request was properly formatted, properly classified, and properly submitted. They died properly, following procedure right up to the end. Jake stood up from his uncomfortable chair and walked to stand beside Dr. Grant. Your species like to talk about the Great War of Words as if words themselves are dangerous. But silence can be just as deadly. How many people died on Kepler 438b because no one was allowed to make a quick decision? How many more will die if we don't start acting like their lives matter more than your paperwork? Commander Velthar of the Altarian delegation had been quiet through most of the emergency session, but now he rose to his full impressive height. The humans speak harshly, but they speak truth. My world's defense fleet destroyed the Devourer, scouts 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes. If we had waited for proper authorization, those scouts would have converted our mining station and 12,000 of my people would be dead or worse. And now? Chancellor Vextai demanded. What happens when every species starts acting without consultation? What happens when military commanders ignore the chain of command? What happens when scientists share classified information with anyone who asks for it? Hive speaker Zektar's compound eyes focused on the Chancellor with predatory intensity. Then maybe we save the galaxy instead of watching it die while we fill out forms. The Korvash delegate's metal form creaked as he stood up. His species was known for being slow to anger and slower to action, but when they finally moved, they moved with the certainty of geological forces. I have lived through 4 centuries of the Silence Protocol, he said, his voice like grinding. stone. I have watched this body debate for decades whether to approve emergency food supplies for famine-stricken worlds. I have seen legislation to combat plague take so long to pass that the disease burned itself out naturally. I have observed the careful, considered, proper procedures that let millions die while we made sure no one's feelings were hurt by hasty decisions. He paused, looking around the chamber at delegates who had never heard him speak so many words at once. The humans are loud and rude and impatient. They ignore our customs and break our rules. They have been part of this galaxy for 6 months and they act like they understand our problems better than species who have lived with them for millennia. Another pause. Several delegates began to nod in agreement. They are absolutely right. The chamber erupted. Some delegates shouted in anger. Others cheered. The translation systems gave up trying to keep up with the chaos of a dozen species all talking at once. In the middle of the noise, Jake Morrison smiled for the first time since entering the Senate chambers. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who had just proven a point that no one wanted to acknowledge. "You want chaos?" he called out over the noise. "This is chaos. 12 different species all talking at once, all disagreeing with each other, all arguing about what needs to be done." He waited for the noise to die down slightly. "And you know what? In the past hour, while you've all been arguing, the Altarian fleet saved 12,000 lives. The Meridian Science Corps shared critical intelligence data with 4 different species, and the Korthak Defense Forces repositioned to protect 2 human colonies that were under threat." The chamber gradually became quiet again. Your silence. Protocol taught you that disagreement leads to war, but disagreement also leads to action. And right now, action is the only thing that's going to save us. The Battle of Nexus Point began at exactly 03:47 hours, Galactic Standard Time. Captain Roy Adams stood on the bridge of the Earth carrier ship UES Determination, watching his tactical displays light up with contact signatures. The combined fleet of 8 species hung in space around him, the largest military force assembled in over 1,000 years. Roy had never commanded anything bigger than a single destroyer before this week. Now he found himself in charge of coordinating communications for a fleet that included everything from massive Altarian battleships to small but deadly Korthak fighter squadrons. The only reason he had the job was that humans were the only species willing to ignore the proper chain of command when people's lives were at stake. "Contact," called out Ensign Pete Jackson from the sensor station. "Devourer fleet emerging from hyperspace." "Count as holy hell, sir. We've got over 200 enemy vessels." Roy looked at the tactical display and felt his stomach sink. Intelligence had predicted a large Devourer force, but this was 3 times bigger than their worst-case estimates. The enemy ships looked like they were made from the same crystalline material that had consumed the outer colonies. They moved through space with fluid grace that should have been impossible for vessels their size. "All ships, this is Fleet Command," Roy broadcast over the communications network. "Enemy contact confirmed. 200-plus hostiles approaching from Vector 77 Mark IV. All vessels prepare to engage." The response came back immediately, but not through the carefully structured military protocols that had governed galactic warfare for centuries. Instead, individual ship commanders from 8 different species all started talking at once. "Korthak Wing 7 ready for engagement. Altarian Battle Group 2 moving to intercept. Meridian Science Vessel Bright Star requesting permission to scan enemy formations. Human Destroyer Lucky 7 standing by. Zelhari Defense Platform. Online and ready." Roy grinned despite the overwhelming odds they faced. For the first time in galactic history, different species were talking to each other like they were on the same side instead of reluctant allies bound by ancient treaties. "Korthak Wing 7, this is Fleet Command," Roy called out as the first wave of Devourer ships approached. "We've got multiple bogies coming through Sector 4 Alpha. Can you intercept?" "Confirmed, Fleet Command," came the immediate reply from Wing Commander Zeknash, Hive Speaker Zektar's own son. "It is an honor to fight beside the Truth Speakers. Moving to engage." The Korthak fighters moved like a swarm of angry wasps, their small ships darting between the larger Devourer vessels and striking at weak points with precision that took Roy's breath away. At the same time, Altarian heavy cruisers opened fire with their main batteries, sending streams of energy that lit up space like artificial stars. But the Devourers fought back with weapons that the galaxy had hoped never to see again. Conversion. Beams reached out from the crystalline ships, and wherever they touched, matter began to change. The hull of the Altarian cruiser. Steadfast started to ripple and flow like liquid metal. "Steadfast is taking critical damage," reported Lieutenant Amy Foster from her position at the communications console. "They're requesting immediate assistance." Roy didn't wait for authorization from the Military Command Authority. All Meridian vessels moved to support Steadfast immediately. Zilhari platforms, focus fire on those conversion beam projectors. The response was instant. 3 Meridian light cruisers broke formation and raced to provide cover for the damaged Altarian ship. Energy shields flowed around Steadfast like protective silk, buying time for damage control teams to work. On the Senate floor, delegates watched the battle unfold through real-time tactical feeds. Chancellor Vextai stood rigid as his carefully maintained order dissolved into what looked like complete chaos, but was actually the most effective military coordination in recorded history. "This is insanity," he whispered, as he watched a human destroyer ram straight into a Devourer battleship to clear a path for Korthak bombers. "They're throwing away centuries of careful military doctrine." Ambassador Lysandra watched as a squadron of human fighters sacrificed themselves to protect a damaged Meridian science vessel. "No," she said softly, her light form pulsing with something that might have been wonder. "They're showing us what we lost when we learned to fear making quick decisions." The tide of battle shifted when Dr. Lisa Grant's research teams, working openly with scientists from 6 different species, managed to crack the Devourer control frequencies. Instead of processing the information through intelligence committees or waiting for proper authorization to share classified data, the humans broadcast their findings to every ship in the fleet immediately. "All vessels, this is Research Command." Lisa's voice came through every communication system in the fleet. "We've broken their command and control system. I'm transmitting counter-frequency data now. Deploy the signal immediately. We estimate you have maybe 8 minutes before they adapt their systems." Roy looked at his tactical officer. "You heard the lady. Deploy the counter-frequency pulse on all bands, maximum power." "Sir, that's experimental technology. We don't know what the side effects might be. The side effect of not using it is that we all die. Deploy the pulse." The counter-frequency signal tore through space like a blade cutting silk. Where it touched the Devourer formations, their perfect coordination suddenly collapsed. Ships that had been moving like parts of a single organism began to drift and collide with each other. "Target their command vessels," Roy ordered. "Hit them while they're confused." The combined fleet poured fire into the disrupted Devourer formations. Altarian battleships, Korthak fighters, human destroyers, and Meridian cruisers all worked together with a precision that should have taken years of joint training to achieve. But the Devourers were not finished. Their ships began to adapt to the counter-frequency signal, and their coordination slowly returned. Worse, they had weapons that the galaxy had not seen before. Conversion missiles that turned entire sections of ship hulls into enemy material. Energy drains that sucked power from reactor cores. Boarding pods that carried creatures designed to remake their victims from the inside out. Captain Sarah Kim of the human cruiser Independence found herself fighting hand-to-hand combat in her own corridors as Devourer boarding parties tried to convert her ship from within. Her crew fought with weapons that had never been designed to face an enemy like this. "Bridge, this is engineering," came the voice of Chief Petty Officer Mike Torres over the internal communication system. "The conversion process is spreading through decks 7 and 8. We can't contain it much longer." Sarah made a decision that would have horrified military commanders from any other species. "All hands, this is the captain. Abandon ship. I repeat, abandon ship. Set the reactor for overload." "Captain," protested her first officer, Commander Lisa Park. "We can still fight. We can still save the ship." "The ship is already lost," Sarah replied grimly. "But we can make sure it takes some of them with us." The Independence exploded in a ball of nuclear fire that vaporized 3 Devourer vessels and damaged a dozen more. Sarah Kim and her crew were picked up by a Meridian rescue ship that had moved to assist without waiting for orders from Fleet Command. Similar scenes played out across the battlefield. Ships from different species working together, sharing resources, making split-second decisions that saved lives and won tactical victories. The kind of coordination that the Silence Protocol had been designed to prevent was exactly what saved the galaxy that day. When the last Devourer ship was destroyed or driven off, the combined fleet hung in space like a constellation of different, colored stars. Ships from 8 species, all battered, all damaged, but all still fighting. All ships, this is Fleet Command, Roy broadcast. Enemy forces are retreating. Repeat, the Devourers are in full retreat. Casualty reports coming in now. The numbers were bad. 37 ships destroyed, over 4,000 casualties, and damage to the fleet that would take months to repair. But they had won. More importantly, they had proven that different species could work together when they stopped worrying about proper procedures and started worrying about keeping each other alive. In the Senate chamber, the delegates sat in stunned silence as they processed what they had just witnessed. The greatest military victory in 1,000 years had been achieved not through careful planning and proper coordination, but through the willingness of different species to trust each other and act quickly when action was needed. Chancellor Vextai's crystal form had lost all color, turning a dull gray that indicated deep shock. "How?" he whispered. "How did they coordinate so effectively without following any of the established protocols?" Jake Morrison, who had been watching the battle from the Senate floor, stood up slowly. They talked to each other. They shared information. They made decisions quickly. They acted like they were all on the same side because they were. He looked around the chamber at the faces of delegates who were beginning to understand that everything they had believed about governance and cooperation might be wrong. You've spent 3,000 years trying to prevent another war of words. But you know what actually prevents wars? Winning them quickly when they can't be avoided. 1 year after the Battle of Nexus Point, Jake Morrison walked through the transformed halls of the Galactic Senate building. The ancient structure looked the same from the outside, but everything inside had changed. The carefully ordered corridors, where different species had once moved in separate designated paths, now buzzed with mixed groups of delegates talking, arguing, and working together. Jake passed a meeting room where Korthak engineers were showing Altarian scientists new fighter designs. In another room, human doctors worked with Meridian healers to develop treatments for conversion sickness. Everywhere he looked, he saw species that had barely spoken to each other for 3,000 years, now collaborating like old friends. The main Senate chamber had been completely redesigned. The old seating arrangement, where each species sat in isolated sections, had been replaced with a more open design where delegates could actually face each other while talking. The ancient podium still stood at the center, but now it was surrounded by smaller discussion areas where real work could get done. Jake took his place at the central podium, but today he was not alone. Representatives from all 12 species stood with him as they prepared to address the newest applicants for Senate membership. 3 recently contacted civilizations had requested to join the galactic community, and they wanted to understand how the government actually worked. The species you represent today have asked why humans are granted special speaking privileges in these chambers, Jake began, looking at the confused delegates from the 3 new civilizations. The answer is simple. We're not. The murmurs of confusion from the newcomers were quickly clarified as Ambassador Lysandra stepped forward. Her light form pulsed with the warm colors that her species used to indicate friendship and openness. Every species in this chamber has the right to speak freely, to share information without restriction, to act when action is needed, she explained. The humans did not earn this right through conquest or special favor. They earned it by reminding us that we all possessed it already. Hive speaker Zektar's mandibles clicked in what his people considered laughter. The old protocol taught us that words were dangerous, that free speech led to war. But the humans showed us that silence can be far more deadly than the loudest argument. The 3 new species looked around the chamber with obvious bewilderment. The Vrex representative, a tall being with angular features and multiple vocal cords, finally spoke up. But what prevents disagreements from becoming violent? Conflicts? What stops arguments from escalating to war? Chancellor Vextai, whose crystal form now glowed with the blue light of humility instead of the red of anger, answered the question. Nothing stops disagreements from happening. And that is exactly the point. For 3,000 years we believed that preventing another war of words required us to barely speak at all. We confused peace with paralysis, diplomacy with silence. Dr. Lisa Grant, now serving as Director of Interspecies Scientific Cooperation, stepped forward to address the practical implications. The galaxy faces constant challenges: disease outbreaks, natural disasters, resource conflicts, technological threats. These problems do not wait for committee approval or diplomatic processing. They require immediate communication, rapid coordination, and the willingness to act on the best available information. She gestured to the display screens around the chamber, which showed real-time data streams from across the galaxy. Information flowed freely between species, no longer filtered through layers of bureaucracy. Last month, the Kepler system experienced a massive solar flare that threatened to wipe out all life on 3 planets. Under the old system, it would have taken weeks to coordinate an evacuation. Under the new system, we had refugee ships moving within 6 hours because everyone could communicate directly with everyone else. The Vrex delegates still looked skeptical, but surely some information must be restricted. Some decisions require careful consideration. Commander Ben Taylor, now coordinating the joint defense networks that protected the galaxy, provided the military perspective. Of course, some information is classified. Of course, some decisions require careful thought. But the default position is openness, not secrecy. When we detect a threat, we share that information immediately with everyone who needs to know. When we need to coordinate a response, we talk to each other directly, instead of sending messages through 14 different committees. Amy Foster, now the youngest senator in galactic history after being elected to represent the growing human alien colonies, added her own perspective. We have had more arguments in this chamber in the past year than in the previous century. We have also solved more problems. The session continued for several more hours as representatives from all 12 species shared their experiences with the new system. There were complaints about the noise, the chaos, the constant need to actually listen to different viewpoints. But there were also stories of lives saved, problems solved, and conflicts resolved through direct communication instead of military action. The Korvash delegate, whose metal tree appearance made him look like a living sculpture, spoke about how open communication had prevented a resource war between his people and the Zelhari. Under the old protocol, our dispute over mining rights in the Tau Ceti system would have taken decades to resolve through proper diplomatic channels. Instead, we argued loudly for 3 days, shared all our data, and reached a compromise that benefits both our peoples. As the formal session began to wind down, the second new species, the Keth, who resembled large, intelligent birds, asked the question that everyone had been waiting for. How do we know this system will last? How do we know that free communication will not eventually lead to the same kind of war that created the silence protocol in the first place? The chamber fell quiet as delegates considered the question. Finally, Jake Morrison stepped back to the central podium. We don't know, he said simply. There's no guarantee that this system will work forever. There's no promise that we'll never have another major conflict. Free speech includes the freedom to say things that other people find offensive or threatening. He looked around the chamber at the faces of beings from 15 different worlds. But we learned something important. During the Devourer War, the solution to dangerous speech is not less speech, it is more speech. When the Altarian trade unions disagreed with Meridian corporate policies 3 months ago, they did not fight a war. They spent a week arguing loudly, presenting evidence, and calling each other names. Then they reached an agreement that satisfied everyone. Ambassador Lysandra's light pulsed with agreement. Freedom to speak freely includes the freedom to disagree freely. We have discovered that most conflicts can be resolved through argument rather than violence, but only if people are allowed to argue. Dr. Grant activated one of the chamber's display screens, showing statistics from the past year. Open communication. has actually reduced conflicts across the galaxy. When problems are discussed immediately instead of being buried in bureaucracy, they rarely grow large enough to require military solutions. The third new species, the Han collective mind, spoke through their chosen representative. What if a species uses this freedom to spread harmful information? What if they lie or attempt to deceive others? Hive speaker Zektar's compound eyes focused on the Han representative. Then other species will disagree with them loudly and publicly. Truth has a way of surviving when people are free to examine evidence and debate conclusions. As the session finally came to an end, the three new species huddled together to discuss what they had learned. The Vrex representative approached Jake as the other delegates began to file out of the chamber. Senior Representative Morrison, we have one final question. Your species was granted observer status only 18 months ago. You had no authority, no established position, no diplomatic weight. What gave you the right to disrupt a system that had maintained peace for 3,000 years? Jake looked around the transformed chamber, thinking of all the lives that had been saved, all the problems that had been solved, all the conflicts that had been resolved through honest communication instead of violence. The same thing that gives you the right to question us now, he said quietly. The truth does not require permission to be spoken. Amy Foster, who had been gathering her papers at the back of the chamber, added her own observation. Humans are not the only species allowed to speak freely here. We are just the species that was willing to speak freely first. The right was always there. Someone just had to use it. As the great doors of the Senate chamber closed for the day, the sound that echoed through the halls was not the ancient silence of the protocol, but something the galaxy had not heard in 3,000 years. It was the sound of 15 different species all talking at once, arguing, debating, sharing ideas, and slowly but surely building a better future together. The humans had indeed earned their reputation through fire and battle, but what they had really given the galaxy was something far more precious than military victory. They had given it back its voice. Above the main entrance to the transformed Senate building, new words had been carved into the ancient stone. They were written in the languages of all 15 member species, but they said the same thing in each one. When people call for help, help them. When problems arise,